the Mishnah, in the Gemara, that the rabbis are very concerned that a person might come to stoke the coals on Shabbat. So we had a lot of laws regarding putting up food. If you put food on a fire before Shabbat, the issue of concern, if the food wasn't fully cooked and the food is still improving, the discussion over there of are we concerned that you might come stoke the coals or not? And that was an issue over there. So here, regarding Hatmana, regarding insulating food. So if you insulate food before Shabbat with an item that adds heat, right? Let's say you insulate it with an item that adds heat. Let's say some ash. If you go ahead and you would place food, wrap it with ash. Let's say you have hot ash. Let's say you put the food in hot ash mixed with mixed with live coals. You might come to rake it on the Shabbat itself if you see that the food is not as hot as you wanted it to be, or you might come to raking it, or you might want to make the cooking, or to hasten to hurry up the process of the cooking. So there is a prohibition to wrap food before Shabbat in an item that adds heat, because you might wrap it with a type of item, might wrap it with an item that you might come to stoke on Shabbat. You might wrap it with, let's say, hot ash mixed with live coals. So that is the concern of wrapping food before Shabbat in something that adds heat. But if you wrap the food before Shabbat, if you instantly take the pot, let's say right before Shabbat, you take the pot off the fire and you wrap the pot in a towel, it's off the fire, it's not adding any heat, that's not a problem. Before Shabbat, to wrap a pot, let's say now it's getting summertime coming and you want to keep the kitchen, you don't want it so hot, so you don't want to keep the fire on. So before Shabbat, you go ahead, you take the pot off the fire and you wrap it in a towel, and you place the pot not in an area where any heat is being added, so that would be allowed. But on the Shabbat itself, you can't go ahead and take a pot off the fire on Shabbat. Let's say you have the pot on the blech or on the plata, wherever you had the pot. And now on Shabbat itself, if you take the pot off, you can't wrap it in the towel on the Shabbat itself. Even though the towel is not adding heat, you're wrapping the original container that the food was cooked in. The rabbi said you can't do that. Now, what's the reason for that? So that's the concern, is that if you are wrapping the food, you're looking to keep the food hot. So if you find the food that you're trying to wrap not so hot, and you find that it cooled down, you might come to actually put it back on the fire on Shabbat. So therefore, you might forget, put it back on the fire. So therefore, the rabbi said, you can't wrap food on the Shabbat. In the original container, you can't wrap the food on Shabbat. So those are the basic two principles that we got. Let's make it clear again. On Shabbat itself, you can't wrap the food, you can't wrap the pot, even though you're not adding heat. If you take it off the fire, you can't wrap the pot. Before Shabbat, the only prohibition is wrapping something that adds heat. If you wrap it before Shabbat with something that does not add heat, it's not a problem. Clear? Now let's see, now the Mishnah begins. Pamet Tomnin.
One second.
Yes.
How we had this discussion last week, whether you can be prohibited from doing anything before Shabbat. Why should it matter that you use ash or anything else that adds heat before Shabbat, because you're doing it on a weekday.
Right. Great. So your action that you're doing on the weekday is not it would not be a biblical problem. Anything that you do on the weekday, there's no biblical problem. But the concern is that you're going to go ahead and the problem will happen on the Shabbat itself by you wrapping it before the Shabbat in this hot ash with some of these live coals. It might, and then it will remain in the hot ash and the hot coals when the Shabbat begins, and you might come to stoke it. Just like we have certain prohibitions, we said you can't leave food on a fire before Shabbat. Let's say a food that wasn't, let's say according to everybody would agree, if it's not a third cooked, you will not be able to leave it before Shabbat. I'm not doing it. I just left it before Shabbat on that fire. But because I might come to stoke it on the Shabbat itself, the rabbis made a prohibition for before Shabbat. So that's the same thing over here, Nathan. It's a rabbinic prohibition. Anything you do before Shabbat is a rabbinic issue. But the rabbinic issue that I can't wrap it before Shabbat with something that adds heat is because the rabbis are here wanting to see it to protect the Torah and to ensure that on the Shabbat itself you won't come to do a biblical prohibition. That's the story over here on this safeguard. Does that answer your question, Nathan? Okay. So the Mishnah says like this. So we're on Mem Zayin Amud Beis. What is it? Mem Zayin Amud Beis 2, 3. Mem Zayin Amud Beis 4. 47b4, correct? 47b4, the new Mishnah? Okay. Now, now, by the way, if you wrap it and you leave one side open, we are lenient. Many are lenient that's not called really wrapping. That's not called, if you leave it. I saw in the Lametet Malacho Sefer that he says, or Ribiat, if you leave it open enough that's if you be wanting to insulate the item, you wouldn't leave it open that amount. That's not called insulating on the Shabbat, or even before Shabbat. What's called insulating? Insulating means that you wrap. Let's say you wrap it on all sides, all four sides. Let's say you wrap it on three, or you wrap it on all the. Let's see if you wrap it on all four sides, but you leave the top open. You don't wrap the top. That's where many are lenient. That it's not a violation. You'll see that they bring down. There's a discussion about that. How far. What's called the wrapping that would be would reach the violation. Because they bring down over here. Some say that if one side of the pot is being wrapped, that would be when the pot is contact with the heat producing substance on only one side. Right, so we have to see more about this, but but we're going with the opinion that's saying that if it's not wrapped on all sides, one side is open, we're going to say that's not called insulating the food. So now, a person who wants to remove the pot from the stove on Erev Shabbat, and he wants to insulate it with something else to keep the heat. What item is he allowed to use to keep the heat? So only is allowed to use an item that's going to keep the heat, but not something that's going to add heat. So now the Mishnah states, "Ain't tomim lo begefet." Gefet is the pulp, let's say, of the olives. Well, the Gemara is going to talk about olives or even sesame. And after you press them, that pulp that's left, it still gives heat. And if you would wrap a food in that item, that food would become that you're adding heat. And since you're adding heat, that will be a problem because the rabbi said if you're going to allow the person to wrap before Shabbat in an item that adds heat, you might come to wrap it with this hot ash with live coals. Now, v'lo b'zevel. You can't go ahead and use the zevel from the excrement from the animals because that also gives off heat. The manure gives off heat. And v'lo b'melech, you can't use salt. Salt gives off heat. V'lo b'sid, not with lime, it also gives off heat. V'lo b'chol, and even the sand. We'll have to see more about this, but the sand, the Mishnah states, also would be a problem. Bain and all these items, bain lachin, bain yeveshin. You know, when they're moist, they give off more heat. And whether these items, whether the manure, the salt, or these items, sand are moist or bain yeveshin, whether they're dry, they still give a little bit. They still add a little bit of heat to the mixture, to the food. But when it comes to teven, straw, the zagin is the remnants, let's say the skin of the grapes after you squeeze the grapes into wine. V'lo b'muchin, and let's say soft pieces of wool, cotton type of things. V'lo b'asabim, or grass, they only increase heat if they're moist. B'zman shehin lachin, when they're moist. Avotom behem, but you could use these items. You could use the straw, the cotton, the grape skin, so to speak, if it's keshehin yeveshin. When they're dry, they don't increase any heat. Since they don't increase any heat, and you're doing this installation before the Shabbat, it's permitted. Adam, is it clear? It's clear? Nathan's clear? So now, Iboilu. Now the Gemara is going to, in the yeshiva, we're trying to clarify the first law. Gefed shel zeitim tanan. The Mishnah says the pulp. You can't insulate the food with the pulp of the pulp. What pulp are we referring to? Is it referring to the pulp of the olives that were pressed, or is it referring to even the sesame? The Gemara understands that the olive pulp gives off more heat than the sesame pulp. So the question is the sesame pulp, is that enough? Is it giving off enough heat that it'll be a problem before the Shabbat to insulate the food with it? The Mishnah is referring to the pulp of the olives, of the morning Simon, of the shumshamin, but the sesame pulp, shapadami, maybe it doesn't give enough heat that's called something that adds heat. Good morning, Simon. Simon, we are on 47b4. We just began the Gemara on 47b4, the Gemara that followed the Mishnah. And we're talking about items that it gives a certain amount of heat, but might be it's called insignificant, that it's not really considered something that adds heat. We're talking about, Simon, insulating food before Shabbat. Taking a food that you cooked already before Shabbat, and you want to keep it warm. And the rabbis made a prohibition. You can't wrap it on all sides with an item that will add heat to the food that you're wrapping. Because we're afraid you might wrap it with hot ash and coals, and then on the Shabbat you might rake it, stoke it. So that's the issue here is what's called an item that adds heat. If you can't, the material that you're prohibited to use to wrap food before Shabbat is only if the material is going to add heat, similar to hot ash and coals that add heat. If you wrap it before Shabbat with a material that does not add heat, a towel, a dry towel does not add heat, you can wrap your pot of soup before Shabbat in a dry towel, as long as you're not putting it near on anything hot. Not, it's dry and you put it on the table. That's not a problem because it's not adding heat. The insulation is not adding heat. But the Gemara is trying to understand what items are considered adding heat that will be a problem. So now the Gemara wants, the Mishnah stated the pulp would be adding, let's say the pulp, the Gemara is now questioning what pulp of an olive or pulp of a sesame. So that's the Gemara's question. The pulp of an olive, the Gemara knows that definitely would add heat enough. If you would wrap a food in it, it would add heat. But the question is, what about the pulp of the sesame? So that's the Gemara's question. The Mishnah only means the pulp of the olives is the problem, of the shumshum and shapedami, but the pulp of the sesame is fine. That's not considered that it gives off heat, and therefore you can wrap the food before Shabbat in the sesame pulp. Maybe the pulp of the Mishnah you can't wrap it is even the pulp of a sesame. That's enough. Adds enough heat that's considered that you're adding heat before Shabbat. It's considered that you insulated the food with a material that adds heat. And you cannot insulate a food before Shabbat, wrap it on all sides with a material that will add heat to the item. That is the issue here. So the Gemara says, maybe, good morning, Asaf. Maybe the Mishnah is talking about even sesame pulp you can't wrap the food in. The kosher came to zaysim, and certainly you can't wrap the olives. You can't wrap the food with the pulp of the olives. Asaf, just to bring you up to date, and hopefully by the fact that I'm repeating to different people that join the class, that everybody will have it clear, will be in their blood, as they say. We're discussing the issue of insulating food before Shabbat, insulating food on Shabbat. But here, and there's also the issue of, there's a concern, there's two separate prohibitions of the rabbis regarding insulating food. You can't, there's a prohibition of insulating food before Shabbat, good morning Nathan, and there's a prohibition of insulating food on Shabbat. However, the prohibition of insulating food on Shabbat does not make a difference what type of material you insulate it with. It could be a material that adds heat, doesn't add heat. Rabbi said you can't wrap it on all sides. However, before Shabbat, the only prohibition of insulating food before Shabbat is with a material. If you wrap the food with a material that's going to add heat.
What if the material is room temperature? How does it add heat?
So if let's say a towel is room temperature. A towel does not add any heat.
How does this some pulp?
But this pulp, it seems like this pulp.
Room temperature pulp.
But room temperature pulp.
Heat.
So it seems that when you have a lot of the pulp to get, maybe when it's together, it gives off a certain amount. You're saying it doesn't give off any heat.
Anything that's room temperature can't suddenly combust and become more heat. I don't get it.
We're not talking about a fire. Salt. Salt is room temperature.
Maybe these room temperature things. I don't understand.
I mean, the Mishnah states salt. You're saying where does salt give off heat? So it sounds like the temperature, according to.
Doesn't make sense.
You're saying where is the temperature? Where is the increase of heat? So maybe you have to do a little experiment and wrap.
Can't be. Things don't spontaneously get warmer.
Um,
Is it possible that the heat of the pot will warm the insulator, and then the insulator will come back to heat the stuff in the pot? Maybe. Maybe maybe they don't mean that it'll give off heat, but that it'll somehow attract heat and then return heat.
you're saying because you're insulating the original pot that was the food was cooked in, and that food in that pot is hot. So now if you wrap the
And it's a good conductor of heat. It could get hot itself and then heat it back. So maybe they mean insulator and not heat.
but when it says something that adds heat,
So
so how do you explain that?
that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sorry.
Okay. Maybe we have to talk to we have to talk to a scientist a little bit. Maybe we'll see what they'll say about it. Good morning. Look at that.
It doesn't make sense, right?
Okay, we have to Adam, right? What does it say? It says it's adding heat. Your question is how is it adding heat, right? That's your question. You're saying it's not adding any heat.
So it's just by insulating it.
By insulating it, if you insulate that pot with salt, you cover the pot. You have a little pot, and you put it into the salt. You cover it with the pulp of an olive, right? That would add some heat. It gives off, the Gemara is saying that it gives off some heat. So let's see. Tashma. The Gemara wants to know what's the pulp of the sesame. Tashma. The Umar of Zayr Shemchad de Rabbi Yana. Rav Zayr said in the name of one of the rabbis from the Beit Midrash Rabbi Yana, Kupa shetamamba. If you have a basket, and in the basket you place the pot in the basket. All right. Now, that's what do you got?
That's what I said. Does not mean wrapping itself generates any energy. Instead, a room temperature wrapping can add heat, quote unquote, by trapping the food's ambient heat, that is the food from the pot, creating a miniature oven in that small localized area, and then raise the internal temperature or concentrate it more intensely. So it's the insulation aspect that itself can become locally even hotter. Let's say you had 100 degrees in the pot and you had 70 degrees in the insulator. And some of the 100 degrees came to the insulator and got it to 80, 90, 100, 110 degrees as that left there, but it concentrated in a little spot. And then that little spot came back to heat something else after the pot itself went down. So it's adding heat after the pot went down because you had more localized heat in the insulator. So it's not that this thing adds heat to the equation. It's that heat left the pot, concentrated in the insulator, and then the insulator came back and reheated the stuff. So it's a question of if the insulator is uniform, it's not a problem. If the insulator can be differentially, if it can be concentrated somewhere, that's the problem.
So according to what you're saying, if you have the pot, and now when you took the pot off the fire, what's the heat of the pot? You have doesn't matter. But when you wrap it in that material,
because the insulator can selectively and in little small areas become very hot because the insulator is not uniform. That's the problem. It's not that the room temperature thing could suddenly give heat to the. It takes the heat from the pot, over concentrates it, and then
in a certain spot it'll become higher. Who says this, Scott?
ChatGPT.
Okay, that's their understanding of it.
But the only way it could be. There is no other way for it to be. Nothing can heat on its own. It can't become more hot than it is.
Okay, so let's
But now it makes sense.
I hear that shot. Okay, we have to see how other commentaries understand this.
It doesn't disagree with anything. It just explains that the word add heat doesn't mean add heat. It means over concentrate and give back heat.
Okay,
Add is the wrong English.
okay. So let's see what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Toshma. So we have a kupa shetomimba. If you have this pot, this basket, and in this basket, you put the pot in this basket, and let's say they would go ahead and they would put, let's say, cotton or cloth.
You know what the difference is between your two examples?
Yes.
Of the towel versus pulp or the sand or whatever. Towels are woven. Things that are granular can get overly hot in a concentrated way because each little, call it a pebble, each little grain, whatever, can become overly hot. But a towel is uniform. And I think that's the big difference between your two examples. Things that have grains or granular or very small pieces versus things that are uniform. And that's why I'll just keep sending the heat further away versus these little, I call them pebbles, but pebbles or grains or grate or whatever it is. Those can become overly hot.
Okay,
Any one grain can become overly hot.
right, and that's called adding the heat. Okay, so the Gemara says, so it used to be, let's say you would take let's say you would take this cotton, dry cotton, and you would go ahead and put it into a box, like a wrapping, like you have a wrap, and then you have it, and then you put it into that box, and then you put into the box, you put the pot of food. So technically, the dry cotton is not doing any heat issue. There's no heat issue of the dry cotton, and therefore there will not be a problem. And putting in the box is not a problem. The box is not doing anything regarding added heat. Again, before Shabbat, talking about before Shabbat. But here the case is, you went ahead and you put this on top of pulp. You put this box, which we had the wrap, which was the food was wrapped in this box. The pot was wrapped in the wrapping in the cotton, and you placed it on this pulp of olives, and the pulp of olives is adding heat. Good morning. So we say that this still it has this. There's the heat from the pulp of the olives that's placed on that pulp of olives. It's gonna add heat to the equation, and therefore there's a problem. Just to bring David up to what we're talking about. We're talking about the issue of insulating food before Shabbat. When are you allowed to, and when you're not allowed to? So we said you're allowed to insulate food, a pot of food before Shabbat, as long as it does not add heat to as long as the item that you're using is not making it hotter. But if the item that you're using to insulate is going to make the food hotter, the pot hotter, you cannot insulate a pot with a material that's adding heat. So now we have a chidush from Rav Zera. Rav Zera says it's not only if you go ahead and you take a
They've got wrapping indirectly as opposed to wrapping directly.
right, exactly, or heating in the right. If you go in and you take the pulp of an olive, after you squeeze the olive, you have the pulp that's left. That pulp, the Gemara says, if you would wrap the pulp around the pot before Shabbat, there would be some issue of adding heat. We use those terminologies just and and the rabbi said you can't wrap something before Shabbat with a heat, which will add heat, which will add. You can wrap it. So not only cannot wrap it in the pulp itself
Correct.
directly, but even if you wrapped it in some other material, and then you place that on the pulp, the heat, the pulp by being placed on the pulp, it will add some heat to the equation, and therefore it would be a problem of insulating food before Shabbat, because that's called insulating with an item that's adding heat. That's what the Gemara says. I'm going to give you an example in my shul. In my shul, they have the plata, let's say, before Shabbat, and they put a kugel before Shabbat on the plata, and then if you want to wrap, if you want to, and to keep it hot, so sometimes they might want to put a towel on top of the kugel of the kugel. Now the problem is if they wrap the towel itself does not add any heat, and they're putting the towel on before Shabbat. But if they would wrap the kugel totally, like they want to put the towel on top of it on all four sides, and it's hidden, the kugel is taman, it's hidden, so that would make that, even though the item that you wrap the food in is not adding heat, but it's on the hot plate. Hot plate is giving off heat, so therefore you would not be able to wrap the kugel, put a towel before Shabbat on all four sides. So what they do is they leave, or six sides, they leave it open on one side. So therefore that is not, therefore it's not called insulated, because no one insulates, when you want to insulate food, you don't leave it open on one side. If you leave it open on one side, that would be fine. So that's, I would say that case of our shul is similar to this case of the Gemara.
So as long as the towel is not under the kugel, your shul is okay.
As long as one side, see, the fact that the plate, you see, the fact that the plate itself, the kugel is on the electric plate itself. So that's a good question. Would that be considered that it's being but it will be wrapped, at least if you throw the towel on all sides, covering here, it's covering here.
It's 5 sides, not 6.
Right, but I don't know if the fact that the bottom of the kugel is on the hot plate itself, it might be an issue. Meaning, if it's
a cooking from before Shabbatish.
But I'm saying if that's called insulated, if the fact that the bottom has the bottom, would that be considered like cover, or we won't consider that as a cover at all? Meaning, if the fact that the towel is not on the bottom,
you're not insulating the bottom. It's done at direct heat.
okay, so that would be a question to look at. Why would they put a towel? They don't put a towel under the cover, right?
Because of this rule.
No, why would someone do that? I mean, you need it. You need it from the hot plate, right? Why
It's
would
an insulation. So the problem here is that towel in general, or dough, and other things that are granular like pulp or sand or salt can get very hot in very small grains or pebbles or whatever, and then give heat back. So the whole idea here was you can insulate with wool, cotton, or towels which dissipate the heat or return it uniformly. But here, the question is, you can't, the rabbi saying that you can't insulate on all 6 sides. And the side you don't insulate is the bottom side. Because then it's not an insulation question. You could say, I put it on the heat source before Shabbat, so it's a cooking topic and not an insulating.
It could be.
Yes.
It's not ducked in.
Right, but the question, I don't know that the fact that I spoke to, I think I spoke to Beryl Feinstein about it. I think his opinion was it would be a problem if you wrap the towel over the plata before Shabbat on all sides. I don't think he said that you have to wrap it on the bottom as well. I if you would leave it,
protection, you don't want to wrap it on the bottom.
you don't want, You don't want to wrap it in, why not? Why not?
Because then you haven't insulated it. in a
I understand, but
row.
it's
It's no longer called insulation. Now we're talking about providing heat. That's a different topic.
I understand, but it still might be part of the problem of insulation if the food is wrapped on all sides, and even if the bottom is directly on the electric plate. So one way to do it is what they do in my shul is they leave it one side. They don't leave it on all six. They don't wrap
So you
the
don't
pallet.
really leave it open on the two sides.
So they put you're right. It's the bottom. There's nothing on the bottom, and there's nothing on the side. But the question would be, if your question, if the fact that it's not if it's not the bottom of the pot is on the electric plate itself, would we say that makes it not insulated? He didn't see. Feinstein, at least after we asked him the question, but he said we should leave one side open, and there also would be a problem of insulating food.
The difference of towel or cover.
Right. Right. So a cover is considered like the pot itself. It's not called an insulator. It's like pot itself.
Sometimes better than putting it down. You put a cover.
Right.
It'll be more insulated.
Right. But
Cold insulation.
right.
Sometimes
But-
covers
but-
are enough, something like that.
Right. Because they want to contain the heat more. So the cover is not considered, according to Moshe Feinstein, the cover would not be considered it's not considered insulated. Let's say if you have a crock pot, you have the cover on, might be those sides might be insulated by the sides, but the fact that the cover of the pot is called the pot itself, it's not called an insulated. And therefore and therefore wouldn't be a great question. Have a great day, everybody. Great to see you back. You too.
Try to come. Right.
We'd love to. Great. Morning. Take care, Saf. Have a good